I had heard stories about Hollowgate Asylum, and they haunted my dreams. But standing in front of it, feeling the chill from the old stones, was worse than anything I had imagined. The place had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, and it felt alive, breathing out a musty smell of decay and mold that I came to Hollowgate because of the rumors. People in town whispered that it wasn't just haunted, it was a place that thrived on fear. Most folk stayed far away, but I wanted proof. As I pushed the door open, it creaked loudly, and I flinched. Inside, the darkness pressed down on me, heavy and cold. My flashlight flickered, barely cutting through the shadows that danced around the peeling walls and cracked tiles. Each step echoed through the empty hallway, and I moved cautiously, kicking up dust that hung in the air. I kept glancing around, checking every dark corner, but it was eerily quiet. The first room I entered was a patient room. An old bed stood bolted to the floor, covered in grime. The restraints hung from the sides, frayed and decayed, but they still looked menacing. I imagined the screams that must have filled this room, absorbed into the walls. Shaking off the feeling, I took a few photos, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest that I continued to explore, finding room after room filled with reminders of lost lives. Old medical tools were scattered on the floor, rusted scalpels and broken syringes, left behind like the people who once used them. As I ventured deeper, the air grew colder. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It began with a soft shuffling sound, barely audible, like someone dragging their feet. I froze, holding my breath, listening. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but silence. That I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the stories were getting to me. But then, as I turned to leave the room, I saw it, a shadow in the hallway, standing still. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, it was a thick, dark figure that seemed to swallow the light around it. My heart raced as I stared, feeling its presence even though it had no face. Suddenly, it moved. Slowly, it began to glide toward me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, gripping my flashlight so tightly that my hands shook. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as if that could keep whatever it was outside. For a moment, all I could hear was my heavy breathing. Then, I heard it again, the shuffling, now closer, just outside the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to listen. Silence hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, and then, a whisper. It was soft, almost too faint to catch, but it was there, a voice speaking words I couldn't understand. The language sounded ancient and wrong, like something that had been buried for centuries. The voice was right outside, drawing me closer, wrapping around my thoughts. That I stumbled back, covering my ears, desperate to block it out. But the voice seeped into my mind, filling it with images of darkness, pain, and lost souls trapped in this place. I realized the truth. Hollowgate didn't just haunt people, it consumed them, turning them into part of the building itself. That I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, listening to the whispers. Eventually, they stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence. I waited, holding my breath, expecting the door to burst open, but nothing happened. Slowly, I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. I turned it, cautiously opening the door just enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty. The shadow had vanished, but I could still feel it lurking, waiting. That I turned and ran. I didn't look back, I just ran, my footsteps echoing through the hall as I rushed toward the entrance. The whole time, I felt like something was right behind me, watching and waiting for me to falter. When I finally burst outside into the cold night, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The asylum loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I felt its presence, as if it was letting me go, for now. That I left Hollowgate that night, but it didn't leave me. Sometimes, I still hear that voice whispering in the dark, calling me back. Deep down, I know I will have to return one day, because once you step into Hollowgate, you're never truly free. The moment I stepped onto the grounds of Ashcraft Hospital, an unsettling feeling washed over me. I had heard tales of the abandoned hospital since I was a child, the place where the sick went and never returned, where whispers of the past echoed through the empty halls. My friends dared me to explore it, and despite the fear gnawing at my gut, I couldn't back down. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and pushed through the rusted gate. The building loomed before me, its once white walls now streaked with dark stains and vines creeping up like skeletal fingers. A chill hung in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I crossed the threshold, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. My flashlight flickered as I entered, casting shaky beams of light that danced across the peeling paint and shattered tiles. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mold and decay. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the very walls of Ashcraft held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. That I wandered through the ground floor, peering into rooms that had been long abandoned. In one, an old gurney lay tipped over, its wheels rusted and immobile. In another, a set of rusted surgical tools lay scattered across a table, as if someone had left in a hurry. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a moment frozen in horror. As I moved deeper into the hospital, I noticed the sounds of the outside world fading away. The distant chirping of birds and rustling of leaves disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence that pressed down on me. I could hear my own heartbeat, a loud reminder that I was alone in this forsaken place. Suddenly, a faint whisper drifted through the air, barely audible, but it sent chills racing down my spine. I stopped, straining to listen. The whispering grew clearer, but the words were indistinguishable, like a forgotten language carried on the wind. My heart raced as I turned in circles, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just empty hallways and shadows. Determined not to let fear consume me, I pressed on, heading toward the stairwell that spiraled up to the second floor. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each groan echoing through the stillness. I reached the top and stepped into the hallway, where the atmosphere felt even heavier, suffocating. As I ventured further, I came across a patient room, the door hanging ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, a bed that sagged in the middle, and an old, dusty chair in the corner. But what caught my eye was a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. That I approached it cautiously, peering into the reflection. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure behind me, a dark silhouette hovering in the corner of the room. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just shadows that twisted in the corners. That I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I noticed it. In the reflection, the figure was still there, only now it was closer, standing right behind me, shrouded in darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around again, ready to confront whatever was haunting me. But the room was empty. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, crashing into the bed. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like a storm. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices penetrated my mind, echoing haunting phrases I couldn't decipher. Get out, leave, help us. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and bolted toward the door. As I reached for the handle, the whispers turned into agonized screams. They echoed through the halls, filling the air with a sense of desperation and sorrow that made my blood run cold. I could feel the shadows closing in, the very walls of Ashcraft pressing against me, urging me to leave. I tore through the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the floor, racing toward the stairwell. As I descended the steps, I could still hear the cries, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. I burst through the front door, stumbling onto the overgrown lawn, gasping for breath. Outside, the air felt fresh and clear, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the hospital. I looked back, the building looming behind me, its windows like empty eyes watching my escape. As I hurried away, the whispers faded into silence, but I knew they would linger in my mind. I had entered Ashcraft Hospital looking for a thrill, but I left with a piece of its darkness clinging to me. I would never forget the shadows that haunted its halls, the cries of those trapped within, and the chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. It was a dreary autumn evening when I received the call to cover the night shift at Ravenwood Hospital. It was an old facility, long past its prime, known for its eerie atmosphere and ghostly tales that sent shivers down the spines of the staff. I had worked there for a year, but I'd never been assigned to the old ward, an area that had been closed off for years after a series of unexplained events and tragic accidents. I was both anxious and intrigued as I prepared for the shift. As I entered the building, the flickering lights cast unsettling shadows across the walls. The lobby was unusually quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of the fluorescent lights above. I made my way to the nurse's station, where my colleague, Sarah, greeted me with a worried look. "You got the old ward tonight, huh?" she said, her voice low. "Be careful. They say it's haunted. People hear things, see things." "Yeah, I've heard the stories," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, but my stomach tightened at the thought. "I'll be fine." After my shift began, I took a deep breath and walked toward the forgotten ward. The hallway leading to it was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of past tragedies. I pushed open the heavy door, which creaked ominously as I entered. Inside, the ward was a time capsule, a mix of dusty furniture, abandoned medical equipment, and old patient records scattered about. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I made my way down the narrow hallway, peeking into the rooms one by one. They were eerily silent, the only sounds being my footsteps and the occasional rustle of a loose paper. As I entered room 4B, the temperature dropped noticeably. I shivered, instinctively wrapping my arms around myself. The room was barren except for a single bed and an old bedside table. A hospital gown hung limply on the back of the door, and I could almost hear whispers floating through the air, soft and unintelligible. My heart raced as I took a step back, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. "Just the wind," I muttered, trying to convince myself. I moved deeper into the ward, feeling increasingly uneasy. The further I went, the stronger the whispers became, wrapping around me like a chilling embrace. I tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, transforming into distinct words. "Help us, help us." I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It felt as if someone was right behind me, their breath on my neck. Turning slowly, I glanced back down the hallway, but it was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I stumbled into the next room. This one was different. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the bed was overturned. Scattered across the floor were old photos, faded and torn. I knelt to pick one up, and my heart sank as I recognized the face of a young girl, her eyes wide with fear. Below her picture was a scrawled message: "They won't let me go." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When they came back on, I saw her, the girl from the photograph, standing at the foot of the bed. Her eyes were hollow, and she wore a hospital gown identical to the one hanging on the door. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the overturned bed. What do you want? I gasped, my voice trembling. What happened to you? But she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the window, her gaze locked onto something beyond my vision. I hesitated but felt a strange pull to follow her direction. I moved closer to the window and pulled back the tattered curtains. Outside, the night was dark, but I saw movement in the shadows, figures, their faces obscured, standing in the yard, watching the hospital. My blood ran cold as I recognized the familiar faces from the photographs scattered across the room. They were all patients who had gone missing over the years. Help us, the girl urged again, her voice trembling with desperation. You can't leave us. I felt a surge of fear as I realized these were not just ghostly apparitions but souls trapped in this place, bound by their untold stories. I will help you, I promised, though I had no idea how. What do I need to do? Find the truth, set us free, she whispered, and in an instant, she vanished. The room grew darker, and the whispers intensified, echoing around me. I stumbled back into the hallway, frantically searching for answers. I needed to know what had happened in this ward, to uncover the secrets that had kept these souls trapped. Back at the nurse's station, I rummaged through the records and old documents. I pieced together a chilling narrative, a series of experiments conducted in the ward, unethical treatments that had caused the suffering and deaths of countless patients. The hospital had swept it all under the rug, hiding the truth to protect its reputation. With a newfound determination, I knew what I had to do. I gathered evidence, photographs, and testimonies from former staff. As dawn broke, I prepared to report everything I had discovered to the authorities. These souls deserved justice. That night, I returned to the ward one last time. As I walked through the familiar rooms, I felt a sense of peace settling over the place. The air was lighter, the whispers now soft and thankful. Thank you, the girl's voice echoed, clearer than before, filled with gratitude. We're free. As I stepped outside into the morning light, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The forgotten ward had shared its secrets, and the spirits of Ravenwood Hospital would finally be at rest. The hospital would soon be shut down, but I knew its haunting tales would linger in the hearts of those who heard them, a reminder of the past and the importance of truth. The night shift at Hollowgate Hospital was infamous among the staff. They whispered stories of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, flickering lights, and even sightings of shadowy figures wandering the halls. I had just graduated from nursing school and was eager to prove myself, so when I got assigned to the night shift, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. As I walked through the front doors on my first night, the oppressive silence enveloped me. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed ominously above, casting eerie shadows across the empty lobby. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was here to help patients, not to get spooked by ghost stories. My shift began with the usual tasks, checking vital signs, administering medication, and attending to the few patients scattered throughout the dimly lit floors. The air felt thick and heavy, almost as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. I dismissed the unsettling feeling and focused on my duties. Around midnight, I made my way to the old wing of the hospital, where the long-term patients resided. The hall was eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of a monitor beeping. As I walked past room 209, I heard a soft whispering sound coming from inside. I paused, peering through the small window on the door. The room appeared empty, the bed neatly made, but the whispering continued. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the haunting murmur that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Shaking off my nerves, I continued my rounds, but the whispering lingered in my mind, a ghostly reminder of the stories I had heard. Later in the shift, I returned to the nurse's station for a quick break. As I sat down, I noticed a stack of charts piled on the desk. One caught my eye, patient records from the old wing, specifically from room 209. I flipped through the papers, and my stomach sank as I read the patient's history. The last entry detailed the tragic death of a young woman named Emily, who had passed away alone in that very room just a month ago. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the station, causing the papers to rustle. I looked up, and my heart raced as I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, her silhouette blurred in the dim light, wearing a hospital gown. I squinted, trying to see her face, but the darkness obscured her features. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it echoed in my mind like a bell tolling. The air grew heavy with sorrow, and I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort her. I stood up, driven by a mix of compassion and fear, and took a step toward her, but as I moved closer, the figure dissipated into the shadows, leaving only an icy chill in the air. My heart raced, and I stumbled back, nearly falling into the chairs at the nurse's station. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize what I had seen. I returned to my duties, but the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. It felt charged, alive with a presence I couldn't shake. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing, and every whisper echoed in my ears. I finished my rounds and prepared to check on room 209 once more. When I reached the door, I hesitated, recalling the woman's pleading voice. Summoning my courage, I knocked softly. "Emily," I called, feeling foolish for even speaking. "Are you here?" There was silence for a moment, and then I heard it again, the whispering, but this time it was clearer, more urgent. "Help me, please." With trembling hands, I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but I could feel the weight of sorrow pressing down on me. I flicked on the light, illuminating the space. The bed was empty, and the air was cold. "Emily, are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispers swelled, surrounding me, engulfing the room in a cacophony of despair. "Help me, find me." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I felt an icy breeze rush past me. I turned, and there she was again, the figure of the woman, standing right beside me. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a desperate longing. "Help me," she gasped, reaching out as if to grasp my hand. Fear seized my heart. "What do you want?" I stammered, stepping back. "I'm lost, please." The shadows danced around her, pulling at the edges of her form, and I realized then that she was trapped, a spirit lingering in the hospital. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my heart aching for her. "I'll help you," I promised, though I had no idea how. The room grew colder, the whispers intensifying as if urging me to leave. But I couldn't abandon her. "What do I need to do?" I asked desperately. Her voice came again, softer this time, almost melodic. "Find my body. I can't rest without it." A wave of sorrow washed over me, and I knew I had to act. "I'll find you, I promise," I said, determined. As I turned to leave, the room began to spin. The shadows closed in, and I felt myself being pulled back. The last thing I saw was her face, a mix of gratitude and sadness, before darkness enveloped me. When I awoke, I was back at the nurse's station, the night shift coming to an end. Confused, I glanced around, wondering if it had all been a dream. But the sense of urgency lingered in my chest. Determined, I gathered my courage and decided to dig deeper into Emily's story. I spent the following days researching her case, uncovering long-buried secrets of the hospital. I discovered that her body had been misplaced after her death, lost amid the chaos of the old wing. Finally, I arranged to have her remains properly identified and laid to rest. The day of her funeral was somber, but as I stood by her grave, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had fulfilled my promise. That night, I returned to Hollowgate Hospital for the last time. As I stepped through the doors, a peaceful warmth washed over me. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive silence was replaced by a gentle whisper that echoed in my mind, "Thank you." I knew then that Emily was finally free, and the hospital, once a place of terror, would begin to heal, too.